When you hear the word barbarian, what do you imagine? Unwashed sword-wielding hordes? Grunting savages who torched libraries and tore down empires? Maybe a fur-clad warrior screaming on horseback, breathing chaos into the civilized world? That's the stereotype, and it's one history has clung to for centuries. But what if it's wrong? What if the people we've called barbarians weren't mindless destroyers, but artists, lawmakers, thinkers, even visionaries? What if the very term barbarian tells us more about the people who used it than those it was used against? In this episode, we're going to challenge everything you think you know about barbarians. We'll uncover surprising truths about the Goths, Vandals, Huns, and others, what they built, how they lived, and why Rome may not have been as civilized as it claimed. Prepare for rebellion, revelations, and a redefinition of what it means to be called a barbarian. The word barbarian. Who gets to define civilization? The term barbarian didn't begin as an insult. In fact, the original meaning was almost comically bland. Ancient Greeks coined the term barbaros to describe anyone who didn't speak Greek. To their ears, foreign languages sounded like nonsensical babble, bar. Hence, barbaros. It was essentially a linguistic shrug. Those who don't speak like us. But over time, as so often happens with words, barbaros took on a darker tone. It came to mean uncivilized, brutish, inferior. By the time the Romans got hold of it, barbarian had become a label for the dangerous other, the peoples who lived beyond the empire's borders, who didn't live in cities, who didn't worship Roman gods, and most importantly, who didn't submit to Roman rule. It's important to note that barbarian was never a name these tribes gave themselves. No Gothic leader ever shouted, "We barbarians shall triumph!" Nor did the Huns or Vandals refer to themselves as such. These were external imposed labels, terms used to dehumanize, simplify, and create a convenient us versus them narrative. Rome, the so-called beacon of civilization, needed to frame its enemies as wild and inferior to justify conquest, slavery, and destruction. This raises a provocative question. Who gets to define what civilized means? Consider the Roman Empire itself. Yes, it built aqueducts, roads, and impressive cities, but it also practiced brutal slavery, public executions, and a level of corruption that would make a modern-day oligarch blush. Gladiators killed each other for entertainment in arenas that cheered for blood. Political dissent could mean crucifixion. And let's not forget Rome's repeated habit of razing cities to the ground when they disobeyed orders, just like Carthage. Many so-called barbarian societies actually practice forms of democratic decision-making. The Germanic tribes, for instance, often elected leaders through assemblies known as things, where free men voiced their opinions and chose chieftains. The Celts placed high value on oral tradition, education, and the power of the Druids, who served as judges, philosophers, and diplomats. The Huns, feared across Europe, had a sophisticated command structure and diplomacy that helped them broker treaties and alliances, until Rome broke them. The savage stereotype often emerges from the victor's narratives. When Roman historians like Tacitus or Ammianus Marcellinus described the Germanic tribes, they focused on their supposed filth, their crudeness, and their drunkenness. But they were doing what conquerors often do, controlling the story. By painting the enemy as savage, their own acts of aggression seemed justified. This wasn't history, it was PR. Let's take a look at the Visigoths. In 410 CE, they famously sacked Rome, a moment often described as the fall of civilization itself. But was it? The Visigoths, led by Alaric I, had long been foederati, allied peoples who fought for Rome and expected protection in return. But the empire failed to pay them, reneged on promises, and treated them as disposable. Alaric didn't want to destroy Rome, he wanted justice. When negotiations failed, the sack of Rome wasn't mindless destruction, it was a political message. And even then, the Visigoths didn't raze the city. They spared churches, avoided wholesale slaughter, and allowed many citizens to live. Hardly the behavior of mindless savages. It's the same with the Vandals. The very word Vandal today means wanton destruction. But when the Vandals took Carthage in 439 CE, they didn't burn it to the ground. They preserved its infrastructure and turned it into the capital of their kingdom. Their sack of Rome in 455 CE, often held up as proof of barbarian savagery, was actually negotiated. Pope Leo I met with Vandal king Genseric and persuaded him not to destroy the city. Genseric agreed. That hardly fits the caricature. Statistics also help disrupt the narrative. According to historian Peter Heather, only about 5 to 10% of Roman deaths in the West during the 4th and 5th centuries were directly due to barbarian invasions. The Fall of the Roman Empire, Oxford University Press, 2006. Far more lives were lost due to internal collapse, plague, and civil war. The empire was rotting from the inside long before the barbarians arrived at the gates. So why does the savage image persist? Because it's clean. It tells a simple story. Rome good, barbarians bad. Civilization versus chaos. It makes for a better movie and a clearer moral line. But history is rarely that neat, and when we flatten it, we lose the texture that makes it meaningful. Here's a modern analogy. Imagine if 2,000 years from now, the only surviving accounts of the 21st century came from political propaganda. No context, no nuance, just the angry headlines. Future historians might assume our world was nothing but division, dysfunction, and violence. They'd miss the art, the resilience, the breakthroughs in science, and empathy. That's what we risk doing when we take Roman accounts of barbarians at face value. Let's take a look into individual tribes, some stories of resistance, and how the barbarians actually shaped the very world we live in. We'll explore the lives of people who were more than swords and fires, leaders, visionaries, survivors. Because the real barbarian story isn't about destruction. It's about mislabeling, misunderstanding, and the dangerous power of a single story. Meet the tribes, the Goths, Huns, and Vandals up close. Let's start with the Goths, often depicted as the ragged destroyers of Rome. But in truth, they had a long history of alliance and cooperation with the empire before things fell apart. The Goths were originally a Germanic people who migrated south from Scandinavia and settled in Eastern Europe. By the 3rd century CE, they had split into two major branches, the Visigoths in the west and the Ostrogoths in the east. The Visigoths didn't just sack Rome and disappear. After their dramatic entry into the Eternal City in 410 CE, they moved into Hispania and established a kingdom that lasted for over 2 centuries. They built infrastructure, minted coins, passed laws, and converted to Christianity. Their legal code, the Lex Visigothorum, was one of the earliest known attempts to blend Roman and Germanic law. It gave legal rights to both Visigoths and native Hispano-Romans, an early form of legal integration that defies the chaos narrative. Then there are the Huns, whose name alone still conjures dread. Led by the infamous Attila, they were seen as the apocalypse on horseback. But the Huns were not just marauders, they were also master negotiators and empire builders. Attila maintained a vast and diverse domain across the Danube frontier. His empire was multi-ethnic, managing alliances with Germanic tribes, Slavs, and even some Roman officials. His military tactics combined mounted archery, speed, and psychological warfare. But perhaps more importantly, Attila understood diplomacy. He negotiated with emperors. He extracted tribute payments instead of resorting to war. And yes, when crossed, he retaliated, often ruthlessly. But even during his invasions of Gaul and Italy, Attila's forces often spared cities that paid tribute or negotiated surrender. And when Pope Leo I met Attila in 452 near Mantua, legend says Attila turned his army away from Rome. Historians debate why. It could have been famine, plague, or strategy. But the fact remains, Rome was spared. And that doesn't align with the mindless destroyer image, does it? Finally, the Vandals. The very word today means destructive thug, but the truth is richer. The Vandals migrated across Europe for decades, driven westward by pressure from other tribes and Rome itself. After settling in North Africa in 429 CE, they established a kingdom with its capital in Carthage, once Rome's fiercest rival. And here's the twist. They didn't destroy Carthage, they revitalized it. Their North African kingdom became a major Mediterranean power. The Vandals maintained Roman aqueducts and infrastructure. They traded actively with other nations. They issued coinage and practiced religious tolerance, at least at first. While their adherence to Arian Christianity clashed with Roman orthodoxy, the Vandals supported scholarship and even allowed Latin literature to flourish. Their sack of Rome in 455 CE, though traumatic, was negotiated. Property was taken, but widespread slaughter and burning were avoided. So, are these the mindless, drooling savages from the old history books? Or are they migrating peoples caught in a collapsing world order, trying to build something new out of the ruins of an empire? What we see again and again is not lawless violence, but displaced peoples navigating chaos, trying to survive, trying to rule, and yes, occasionally fighting. But in that, how different were they from Rome? Why civilizations collapse, and why the barbarians took the blame? One of the greatest ironies of history is how often those accused of destroying a civilization are simply present when it falls. That's certainly true of the so-called barbarian invasions of the Western Roman Empire. But to blame the Goths, Huns, or Vandals for Rome's downfall is like blaming the final raindrop for the flood. By the time Rome fell in 476 CE, it had already been decaying for centuries. Its bureaucracy was bloated. Its economy was strained by over-reliance on slave labor, corrupt tax collection, and hyperinflation. Civil wars, sometimes 2 or 3 per decade, shattered any sense of stability. In fact, between 235 and 284 CE, Rome had over 26 emperors. That's roughly 1 emperor every 2 years. Most were assassinated. The army, once Rome's pride, had become a political bargaining chip. Troops were underpaid and undertrained. Roman generals often hired barbarian mercenaries to fight Rome's wars. These men became essential to Rome's defense, but they were often despised and undercompensated. Is it any wonder that, when pushed too far, they turned against their employers? When Rome's fall did come, it wasn't one catastrophic invasion. It was death by 1,000 cuts, many of them self-inflicted. The historian Brian Ward Perkins, in his book The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, Oxford University Press, 2005, describes the empire's slow unraveling not as a violent conquest, but as a profound and painful economic collapse. That's what makes the barbarian scapegoat narrative so frustrating. Rome's fall became a moral tale. The civilized world was brought down by uncivilized hordes. But in truth, it was more like a forest that had dried out from years of drought, and the barbarians were just the final spark. What's also telling is how many barbarian rulers tried to preserve Roman traditions. The Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great ruled Italy in the 6th century, not as a destroyer, but as a protector of Roman culture. He preserved Roman law, repaired infrastructure, and hired Roman administrators. He even maintained the Senate and wore Roman-style clothing. In letters and proclamations, he styled himself not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a Roman statesman. That doesn't sound like someone trying to erase civilization. It sounds like someone trying to keep it alive. But it's easier, especially in times of chaos, for people to look outward for blame. To point at the unfamiliar, the foreign, the other, and say they did this. The story becomes simpler, cleaner, more comforting. And that's the danger of the word barbarian. It compresses nuance, it silences complexity, and it makes history a morality play instead of a human saga. What the barbarians left behind: hidden legacies and living influence. Even after the dust of Rome settled, the so-called barbarians continued to shape the world in lasting ways. Their kingdoms became the foundations of medieval Europe. Their laws, languages, and cultures didn't disappear. They evolved, and so did our world because of them. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain laid the groundwork for later Spanish statehood. Their legal code influenced medieval law, including the development of property rights and the concept of trial by ordeal. Their architecture blended Roman styles with Germanic flair, creating something uniquely Iberian. The Ostrogoths in Italy preserved countless Roman texts. Theodoric's court was a haven for scholars, and his librarian, Cassiodorus, helped copy and store classical literature. Without these efforts, entire swaths of Roman philosophy and science might have vanished. Even the Vandals, despite being vilified in name, contributed to the naval technology of the Mediterranean. Their fleet challenged the Eastern Roman Empire, forcing the Byzantines to adapt. And let's not forget the Lombards, Franks, and Saxons, once lumped in as barbarians, who became kings and emperors of what we now call France, Germany, and England. The very languages we speak, English, French, German, are peppered with words of barbarian origin. Our legal systems, our concepts of honor, our folk traditions, and even our stories of heroism owe much to the people once cast as destroyers. One surprising legacy? Democracy. The tribal councils of the Germanic peoples, where free men gathered to make decisions, are among the earliest seeds of representative governance. These ideas were planted long before they bloomed in modern democracies. So why does the image of the barbarian persist? Because myths are hard to kill. They serve a purpose. They draw a line between us and them. But when we look closer, we see those lines blur. The barbarians weren't just invaders. They were migrants, refugees, warriors, farmers, and poets. They didn't end civilization. They transformed it. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history? Impress your friends. and predict the future more accurately based on past events. If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the history of these different people, check out our book, History of the Barbarians, a captivating guide to the Celts, Vandals, Gallic Wars, Sarmatians and Scythians, Goths, Attila the Hun, and Anglo-Saxons. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.